All right, we are ready.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Global Taiwan Institute. My name is Russell Shao. I am the Executive Director here at GTI. GTI is a 501c3 think tank dedicated exclusively to Taiwan policy research and related programs. Our mission is to enhance the relationship between the United States and Taiwan with the world by contributing to a more informed discussion about Taiwan and its people. In pursuit of that mission, we undertake several major core programs. They include our biweekly Global Taiwan Brief, public seminars, an annual symposium in the fall, as well as scholarship and fellowship opportunities, including 3 podcasts that we produce here in-house. Our Taiwan Security Review, the GTI Insights, and Taiwan Salon. If you're not already subscribed to receive all our updates directly in your inbox, you may do so by visiting our website at www.globaltaiwan.org. And I would just like to begin also today's program by thanking our co-founders, our board of directors, our advisors, as well as all the staff and interns here at GTI that make all our programs possible. So today I'm very delighted to be able to be joined here today with my good friend Michael Sobolik. Michael is a senior fellow at the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the American Foreign Policy Council. His work covers American and Chinese grand strategy, regional economic and security trends, as well as America's alliance architecture in Asia, as well as human rights issues. Very important and broad portfolio. He is also the host of an excellent podcast. I would highly encourage all of you to listen to it.
You're the second guest I ever had on that podcast.
All right. All the more reason why it's an excellent podcast. It's called the Great Power Podcast. It's the AFPC's show about great power competition and U.S.-China relations. And Michael has a great lineup of excellent analysts, not including myself, that has participated in that excellent podcast. So prior to joining the AFPC, Michael has also served in the U.S. Senate from 2014 to 2019. And while he was there, he also drafted a number of legislations related to China, Russia, India, Taiwan, and North Korea and Cambodia. So really, I think pertinent in terms of the knowledge and experience that Michael is bringing to bear in the writing of the book that we are here to talk about, which is his new book, Countering China's Great Game, Strategy for American Dominance. So today's book talk is actually a continuation of a line of book talk series that we have conducted here at GTI. And we really want to feature really thoughtful policy analysts who really invest, both the physical and mentally, energy that is required in really putting them down on paper, their ideas and bigger ideas that on a day-to-day basis, where as a think tank covering the current developments here and now, that sometimes it's just not the bandwidth to really do. And so we're really delighted that Michael has taken the time to write this book. And so when he had brought the book to my attention, I've actually known about this process that Michael has been in for quite some time, and really just proud and delighted to see that he has finally come to fruition, and that it is just the excellent quality that it is. And so with the time that we have with him here today, I also want to mention that we do want to have engagement from our audience members, both here in person as well as online. So we'll save about 10 to 15 minutes at the end of the session for those questions and answers. And so those of you listening in online, you may do so by sending us an email at contact@globaltaiwan.org, or you can use the chat function on the YouTube page, or even tweet us also on X. So, I want to dive right in to this conversation. I wanted to make this much more than a sort of a single one-way sort of discussion and more of a discussion for us to be able to have a conversation about your book. Read your book is, this is the proof that I've read it when I put all these, page markers there. Because there's so many important nuggets of information here that I think often gets lost if it's not really sort of drawn out in a conversation style. So, and as I often do, with in just sort of opening up these types of book talks, is I want to sort of open an open-ended question because, as I said, writing is a very physically and mentally demanding, really endeavor. And so. Really, like for you, Michael, like what motivated you to write this book?
Winning a Cold War was the primary motive for writing it. And before I get into explaining that, thank you, Russell, for hosting. Thanks for convening and for your kind words, for your encouragement, your friendship, and the opportunity to have a conversation, not only about the book, but the broader challenges that the book is about, which, speaking of challenges and Cold Wars, so the book has three main arguments. And the first one is that the relationship between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party is not only one that's defined by adversary and confrontation, it's a systems level struggle in the ideological realm and the geopolitical realm across the board. This is the second Cold War that's going after we defeated the Soviets successfully. And the second argument that I make is that we're losing that Cold War right now, which has gotten some contestation in some of the other book talks I've had on the DC circuit. Because if you look at China's long-term demographic outlook and its long-term economic trends, they have some problems. They have some real problems that they're going to start bumping into. They're reaping what they sowed with the one-child policy for a long time. And Xi Jinping, I think, is going to continue discovering that if you double down on the production side of your economy with no meaningful reforms on the consumption side, you can only go so far with a model like that. So they're going to bump into these problems, but in the next decade or so, they're going to have the luxury of not really being under the gun in those two key areas. And this is a key moment of opportunity for them to lock in strategic gains, which makes this time that we're living in, I think, very consequential and potentially dangerous and destabilizing. And they realize that, and I don't think enough American policymakers appreciate how important this window is. And they're winning and we're losing right now because we're not going on the offensive. We are reacting and responding to all these strategic problems that the party has created for America. What we're not really doing is creating problems for them. And this is the third point I make, which is you don't win Cold Wars by, I'll put it this way. I'm from Dallas. My Dallas Mavericks are in the NBA playoffs right now. And there's this aphorism that good defense wins championships. That might be true in professional athletics, but in great power competition, you do not get a gold star from anyone by taking care of your own homeland. You win Cold Wars by forcing your adversary to compete on weak strategic terrain. That's what we're not doing, and that's what I'm convinced we have to start doing if we're going to win.
I want to return back to the bigger picture later in our conversation, but in just kind of following the natural trend, sort of the logic and the process of your of how you wrote this book, you led in within your introduction of your book, and that's usually for any author who writes, it's usually the framing sort of key point, right?
Yeah.
And you led in with Taiwan.
Yeah.
You led in with a story about Taiwan. Why did you do that?
I think Taiwan is today what the barrier between East and West Germany was during the First Cold War. And like every analogy is imperfect, but if you think back to that Cold War and what was that dividing line, not only ideological dividing line, but like the literal, like if the Soviets were going to invade Western Europe, where is that demarcation point? Like what were we trying to defend at the front lines? I think Taiwan is the front line of defense in the Second Cold War. that we're in. And for so many reasons, but the vignette that they write about in the introduction was in 2016 when I was the Indo-Pacific and China policy hand for Senator Ted Cruz from Texas. I went on a delegation trip to Taiwan and we had a meeting at their Ministry of Defense. And naturally, the question came up, how long could Taiwan survive absent American support, direct American support, if the People's Liberation Army were ever to invade or conduct a blockade or whatever scenario? And the answer that we got in 2016, so this is about 8 years ago, the answer that we got then was a month, 30 days. China has more ballistic missiles than they did 8 years ago. They have stronger cyber capabilities. They have more ships. Their air superiority, air denial capabilities are much more developed and sophisticated. I think it is safe to assume that that window is smaller today than it was in 2016. And I think for me, there were a few moments during my time in Congress that I personally had this growing realization that this is a zero-sum struggle that the United States is in, whether we realize it or not. That trip to Taiwan was one of them. And I think the other reason I led with Taiwan is if the Chinese Communist Party successfully invades and brings Taiwan under the sovereignty of the People's Republic of China, I don't think they're going to stop there. And I think this is another point that is hotly contested in like the China policy community in DC, because Russia is widely seen as an imperialist power, China less so. And one of the big arguments that I make in the first half of the book is the Chinese Communist Party is highly ideological for obvious reasons, but they also are the inheritor of a broader dynastic foreign policy and strategic culture that has been around long before Mao Zedong established the PRC in 1949. And I think the imperialist threat that the CCP poses, and it's near abroad, but like the Belt and Road is a global imperialist project. And I think Taiwan would be the first domino to fall. And if it does fall, we're not going to like the world we're going to live in. So I think it's one of the most important things.
Oh, we'll get into the Chinese strategic culture, because you do spend a good deal of time to go into these concepts and the ideas and sort of understanding sort of Chinese strategy on their own terms, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, right? And that's we'll get to that. But I want to stay with Taiwan a little bit, since we are the Global Taiwan Institute after all. So staying on Chinese strategy, and your book is called China's Great Game, right? And Great Game, of course, very different historical preferences in terms of grand strategy.
Yeah.
So sticking with Taiwan, what is the role of Taiwan in China's Great Game?
So let's start with geopolitics, and then we can take it from there. Because when you talk about like the Great Game, that harkens back to Eurasian competition between primarily the British and the Russians about Central Asia in the 19th century or so, over a long period of time. And there was this struggle over which imperial power was going to dominate Eurasia. And for China, the Chinese Communist Party in particular, they are looking at the world not only through a terrestrial perspective, but from a maritime perspective as well. And even beyond like the world that we see and experience, like they're looking at this from a technological perspective too. And if you look at Taiwan, it absolutely, I mean, primarily more than land, it's a maritime important issue for them. Because if you control Taiwan, you have the most strategic deep sea berth for your submarines into the open Pacific that they can get to the open Pacific, but Taiwan constrains them into the first island chain, right? And the US presence in Japan has that quite a bit as well. But the question is, like, if Taiwan falls, what does that mean for our force posture? Because if Taiwan falls, that's going to, presume that something happened to Kadena Air Force Base in Japan and something happened to our presence in the Philippines that like we were unable to prevent this from occurring. So number one, their ability to dominate near and near abroad within the first island chain, their ability to, even more than they are already doing now, challenge us in the Pacific Island region, even a far field to Guam and Hawaii. like geopolitically, it's not just them having a secure East Asia for defensive reasons. That Taiwan is a springboard. They want to turn it from a cork into a hub. But it's more than just geopolitics. So, like, I think a tension I have in my book is one of the biggest mistakes DC strategists make is by having this bifurcation between material interests and morality in foreign policy. Oftentimes they intersect in so many ways that go underappreciated. And with Taiwan, it is one of the greatest ideological challenges to the Chinese Communist Party because their line has been only the CCP. Like, this is the only political entity that can make China great in the 21st century, to reconstitute the horrors of the century of humiliation, to bring back China's civilizational greatness, to match that with political influence. And for Xi Jinping, like, he wants to be the man who does that. And the propaganda has always been only the party can do this in China. But if you look across the strait, you have another culture that for like thousands of years shared China's culture. And it is one of the most vibrant democracies on the face of the planet. So for ideological reasons as well, like the party wants to, from their perspective, liberate Taiwan. It's a chilling way to talk about it. But it is the most important foreign policy goal for the CCP right now.
I want to turn back to the this issue of what the role of Taiwan is later in our conversation, because I asked you what the role of Taiwan is in China's great game is, but I think maybe at the bookend of this conversation, I want you to think about, what is Taiwan's role in U.S. strategy for countering China's great game?
Let's end on that note.
Yeah, and then we'll end on that note. But getting to these, so this book is about Chinese strategy, right? So and strategy is about matching means with ends, right? The ends with means, right? And then and you talk a lot about the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. So let's talk a bit about the Belt and Road Initiative, where you see that the role of the Belt and Road Initiative, or I think as you and I both agree, I think we'd rather call it One Belt, One Road, because this is exactly how China refers to it, right? Yes. Right? And what is its role in China's great game?
It is their effort to rejigger the strategic and the economic focus away from the West and toward the East, away from Washington and toward Beijing. And I think there are a few mistakes that you can make when you look at something like the Belt and Road. So number one, a lot of folks will reduce it solely to infrastructure projects. If you look at the 5-point plan that Xi Jinping has always had about the BRI when he rolled it out in 2013, infrastructure is like point number 3 for the BRI. I think point number 4 is commerce conducted in local currency. Point 5 is people-to-people relationships. Point 2, I think, is cross-border trade. And point number 1 is policy coordination. It's like the BRI, all the press it's gotten has understandably focused on like the bridges and the soccer stadiums and the ports and like the big visual realities of the BRI. But it has never been a primarily economic project, ever. That China has lost a great deal of money on the Belt and Road. Like, this is, none of it is sustainable development in the Western, like, American understanding of like sustainable development that can outlive the presence of the country, like offering the assistance. And none of it is profitable for these state-owned enterprises from Beijing at all. Like, there's a reason for that. Like, state-owned enterprises are not meant to care about turning a profit. They are meant to carry out the work of the state in the market. And it is first and foremost China's and the party's effort to box out Western competitors to gain a foothold in the strategic sectors and strategic choke points and strategic countries on the map for the Chinese Communist Party to begin locking in its global presence at the expense of American influence. That is the purpose of the Belt and Road. And if you look at how that fits into other things, they use the Belt and Road to flip Taiwan's allies all the time, like in the Pacific Island region in particular, some of this in Latin America too. And what they will then do, and this is why I disagree with a lot of DC folks who think the Belt and Road is a has-been. Yes, it gets less funding for infrastructure than it used to, but it's entering its second phase, which is militarization. Beijing is going to these nodes in the Middle East and Africa, the Pacific Islands, and in our own hemisphere. And they are building on the beachhead that they had initially made with Belt and Road Project's Memoranda of Understanding. And they are now seeking port calls for the People's Liberation Army Navy. The satellite surveillance facility in Argentina is a great example of this too. They're building out their global military footprint on the back of Belt and Road investment. That is the specific concern today for Washington policymakers. And I think it is so woefully underappreciated.
Let's get into the logic of Chinese strategy now, and so, as I mentioned earlier, I think one thing that you really try to do in your book is really try to understand the Chinese in their own terms. And so you focus, a number of chapters in your book explaining the relevance of the concept of 中国 and 天下, as well as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and explaining that. Why are those concepts, in your view, important to understanding Chinese strategy and its application to this, China's great game?
So I'm saying this as somebody who was born in 1988. I caught the tail end of the Cold War, so I'm not speaking as somebody who lived through the Cold War, but I've learned in my studies that one of the biggest mistakes we made was mirror imaging, where you assume that just because something is rational or feels rational to you, that your competitor is going to process information the way you do, and that they're going to reach the same conclusion that you do. Like, this was the big problem with mutual assured destruction during all of those, Armageddon conversations during the Cold War of how do we have a stable balance of terror with nuclear weapons? Like, we came to find out the Soviets didn't actually conceive of nukes the same way we did. And a lot of that was because of their strategic culture. And I spent the entirety of the second chapter of this book laying out a basic primer of Chinese strategic culture, which there are like tomes this thick that are about Chinese strategic culture. So doing it in one chapter was a bit of an undertaking. But the other motive I had is I've gotten so sick of hearing that America plays chess and China plays Go. And people just saying that and assuming that it's some like self-evidently brilliant observation where, there are two different games with two different strategies, but what does that actually tell policymakers about how the Chinese Communist Party processes strategic decisions? It gives you an abstract understanding that might be useful in some circumstances, but it doesn't give you enough to really understand their motive and like the story they see China in. So those two phrases you mentioned, 中国, I think anyone who has like some passing familiarity of China has probably come across this term in Mandarin before. Middle Kingdom is usually what it's translated to now. And I spent the book talking about where this phrase came from. And it was at first just a description of where early proto-dynasties of China literally saw itself geographically, like living here in the middle region of the area. You see inscriptions kind of like that in ancient pottery. But over time, it took on this civilizational component, and China was the thriving civilization in its neighborhood well before the time of Christ, like hundreds of years before the time of Christ. And it was surrounded by largely raiding and barbarian tribes that would come from, safe but mountainous territories where there wasn't this stable civilization. They would raid China. And from China's perspective, like everyone wants a piece of us. Like this is where wealth is, this is where stability is, this is where families are. And over time, understandably, I think that they rightly developed a superiority complex in their own neighborhood. And that leads pretty directly, I think, to this other description that you mentioned, 天下, all under heaven, which if you look at how Chinese emperors from like the Qing dynasty to the Han dynasty and throughout even like the CCP maybe won't use these terms, but it's how they still conceive of their influence. The emperor in Chinese dynasties was self-described as the son of heaven. And if you are the son of heaven, then in theory, you should be ruling under everything under heaven. And that's kind of where this idea comes from, that China's political influence should match its civilizational hegemony. And that is what, in the course of writing this book, like I came across some authors, one I think from Cornell, who called that, characterization the touchstone of all Chinese political theory. And it's simple, perhaps an oversimplification, but I think it's a good starting point. And the big bottom line of that is, in theory, there's no limiting principle on what all under heaven means, which I think, if you look at the first Chinese dynasty, established in 221 BC, to the final dynasty, which collapsed in 1912 AD, China grew by a factor of 4 over that course of 2 centuries or so. Some of that was wars of defense, much of it wars of offense. And one of the big things I did during this book was have this Excel spreadsheet of Chinese dynasties' war of offense and expansion, and it's a big spreadsheet. So I think that framework of imperialism just running as a deep current through China's history. Like, don't take my word for it. Talk to the Koreans, talk to the Vietnamese, like talk to people who have lived in China's doorstep and in China's shadow. And it's no mystery to anyone in the region, like the story of the Middle Kingdom and what it means.
Challenge a lot of conventional wisdom that we see, and that's one of the notions of strategy, understanding the strategy, the Chinese strategy. Another one is that you wrote here in your book, and I quote, "One unchanging constant in America's China policy since Nixon's meeting with Mao in 1972 is a steady commitment to regime change, either by commerce or competition," end quote.
This might be quite a provocative statement, in fact, because this is actually getting into the ongoing debates between the likes of Fareed Zakaria and Matt Pottinger and former Congressman Mike Gallagher. But you're saying basically it's not the same. It's all regime change. Like, explain a little bit about it.
Yeah, so let me unpack that. So Matt wrote the foreword for the book, and the price of the book is worth just the first 4 pages. Like, Matt's foreword is incredible, and he picked up on themes of the book that I, as the author, hadn't even picked up on myself, which is an amazing compliment to be paid whenever someone like reads that and, oh, this is amazing. I didn't even know it was there. So I have all the respect for Matt and what he did in government. And on the argument that's happening between him and former Representative Mike Gallagher and Fareed, Fareed didn't read their article closely enough, because Matt and Representative Gallagher do not openly call for Iraq or Afghanistan style regime change in China. Like, if you read their article closely, or even just tentatively, that argument is not there. What they do say is, we need to start making the Chinese Communist Party uncomfortable if we're going to win a Cold War, which is the exact same argument I make in my book as well. And I came to the same conclusion that they came to, which is we shouldn't make allowances for the pathologies of the CCP. The burden is not on us to go easy on the party because they have a brittle and unstable regime. That's not on American policy made. That's not a burden for us to carry. That's a burden for the party to carry. I also think, though, that if you look at what I would say, highly misguided policies from Nixon, even to now, the gambit that Nixon and even folks like George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton and like successive Republican and Democratic presidents had was, if we trade with China and engage economically, we can change them politically. That's what I mean by it's kind of always been regime change by whatever means you approach. Like, that was our assumption. Like, when the Berlin Wall fell, we really thought history was over, and that democracy was an inexorable destination for all governments. And that belief, I think, underpinned a lot of the policy of engaging the party, even knowing all of its atrocious human rights records, because we thought we can change them. Maybe it might not be like the CCP falls, but the CCP will not be a Marxist, belligerent thing anymore. And I think that belief was an undercurrent, oftentimes not said explicitly, but I do think that was an implicit hope from a lot of American policymakers. And surprise, surprise, it hasn't turned out that way.
You have a lot of excellent quotes in this one. I just want to quote another one, and I think this is also one of these with the a key sort of, it jumped out at me as one of a very insightful and a comment about the current strategic context we're in. And here I quote, great power competition didn't just happen during the Cold War. It was a product of conditions that did not exist between Washington and Beijing today. That is failure of naive triumphalism presupposes an outcome, peace. That is often the result of a successful exercise of unilateral state power. The very thing the New World Order seeks to limit and control.
Oh, yeah.
Expand.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So when I got my master's from literally George H.W. Bush's School of Government at Texas A&M. So I have a great deal of respect for the former president. I think he was a good man. And in many ways, he was a thoughtful, prudent leader. I also think he really misjudged China. And I also think he bought into that naive triumphalism, which is there's no trade-off between our economic interests and our security interests. And if you read, like the whole phrase, like New World Order today, kind of has like reeks of conspiracy theories. Like there's this secret cabal of the hidden global government that's going out to rule everything and is like pulling the strings behind the scenes or whatever. The actual reality, I think, is more disturbing, which is our government elites thought that they didn't really have to engage with trade-offs anymore after winning the Cold War. Like, winning a Cold War without firing a shot kind of goes to your head, because that was one of our biggest foreign policy achievements as a country in our history. Like we were in 1991, I think you can make a great case that America was the most powerful country in the history of humanity. Like that kind of gives me chills, like thinking about it. Like we are alive during that time. Like that's an amazing privilege, but it also kind of intoxicates you as policymakers who have such a windfall of peace and victory and prosperity. And I think George H.W. Bush thought that we could go on autopilot and trade our way into perpetual peace. That is just not the case. And even more than that, like when I mentioned that this new world order that the former president talked about, a lot of it was focused on strengthening multilateral institutions at the expense, in some cases, of exercise of unilateral state power. And this is one of the big tensions that we always find ourselves debating in Washington. Like, how do you counter an adversary? Does America lead first and then your allies will follow? Or do you like lockstep with your allies and all march together at the same time? Like multilateral or unilateral? I think that one of the worst mistakes that a few presidents of recent memory, I would put Barack Obama in this category, I would put Joe Biden now in this category as well, is valuing multilateralism as an end unto itself instead of understanding that it is a means to an end. The end must be securing America's interests, our foreign policy, national security interests. Multilateralism is not an inherent good. Unilateralism is not an inherent good. Like they really shouldn't even be talked about as isms. They are approaches of foreign policy. And the main thrust of my book is, it's actually not really academic or complicated. America needs to lead if we're going to win. That is the only way that we are going to prevail in a zero-sum competition with the Chinese Communist Party. I get into what leadership looks like at the end of the book. I have a feeling we'll probably get there so we can just make that more practical. But we have got to stop being afraid of our own shadow and go on the offense against these guys and figure out where they're weak and start forcing them to compete there.
I think if anyone who reads your book, they certainly wouldn't be able to fault you for not being an equal opportunity critique of both Republicans and Democrats. And I think you have a fair share of, I think, fault that goes around and driving to where we are now in this current, sort of situation that we're in. You put a lot of stock in India in, countering China's great game. Can you explain a little bit why you think India is playing such a pivotal role in your outlook of this strategy for countering China's great game?
India is going to be tricky. India is going to be tricky for a few reasons. My wife and I were actually in India last year. We were there for about 5 weeks or so, just for personal reasons. And during our time there, I picked up a volume of an Indian scholar who talked about what the British Raj was like for India. And it was a sobering account of what it was like to be on the receiving end of European imperialism. And I'll put it this way, politically, I'm a conservative, so I think that generally America is a force for good in the world. I think there was a lot of great things that have come out of Western civilization. I think it's worth defending. I also think imperialism is probably not one of those things that's worth defending. And there's a reason that India has been perpetually a non-aligned power ever since the Raj left. And I mean, they're not really non-aligned now in the sense that materially, geopolitically, their interests lie with us, the Japanese and Australians. Absolutely not with Beijing, and you see that, just look at the border, at the Sino-Indian border, you see it every day. But India doesn't really fit into this neat, tidy box of allies and partners that American strategists tend to conceptualize of a lot. But that's the other reality is they're kind of the most important hedge geopolitically that we have against the People's Republic of China. Their population recently surpassed China's population, and China's population is dipping down, and India is going the exact opposite direction. And if they can figure out how to have sustainable development and also defend minority rights inside of their own country, real issues that question marks still there. But the potential for them to emerge as one of the most important and influential players, not just in South Asia, but even East Asia, that potential is there. And there are going to be some things militarily and economically that America just can't do alone. One of them is going to be trying to offer BRI alternatives at cost to the global South. And we need the Indians, the Japanese, and the Australians with us doing that.
Let's turn the table a little bit on European imperialism and the impacts of that to a bit on China. Because you go at the beginning, you mentioned about what is this, the offensive campaigns in Chinese history that it's been on. And I think on this point, I think you make another very insightful observation here. And I want to read this to you, and I want you to explain it to our audience, is that the CCP is one of several dynasties that measure success not by its number of fronts, but by its tributary total. Having ignored this reality for decades, our national muscles have atrophied. All the vestiges of strength, America is 2 steps behind Beijing. So can you bridge that from sort of the history to the impact of strategy?
So, former congressional staffer, I cannot tell you guys how many Senate Foreign Relations hearings I have either been to or watched or prepped my old boss for. That some senator on either side of the aisle would invariably say this exact sentence over and over and over again. America has countless allies and partners. China has 0, maybe North Korea. And if North Korea is the closest thing you have to an ally, that's not an impressive Rolodex. But I don't think that actually matters that much from the CCP's perspective, because they are not out to foster and create allies, not in the way that America thinks about alliances. That is not what the party's statecraft has looked like at all. It's also decidedly not what Chinese dynastic foreign policy looked like either. They weren't trying to have peer-to-peer relationships. They were the enlightened civilization that everyone else was expected to pay tribute to and physically prostrate themselves before. The tribute system was exactly that. Foreign dignitaries making the trek to Beijing or Xi'an or wherever the capital was in whatever dynasty we're talking about, and physically prostrating themselves before the son of heaven and pledging their fealty to the dynasty, and then getting some economic favors in exchange for it, and political legitimacy from China as well. That was the currency of the tribute system. And you see a lot of that today with China's foreign policy in the Belt and Road. Take Africa, for instance. You have a lot of economic projects that are not profitable at all. Some of them come to fruition. Some of them are woefully behind schedule. But what you do see, even putting the economic side aside, you see China doing something that the West and Washington just is not doing as well, which is bringing those elites in the global South to Beijing, putting them up in the 5-star of all the 5-star hotels, bringing them in for personal conferences with Xi Jinping, and not only elevating their stature, but then turning around to them and saying, can you come on the 7 o'clock news and extol the greatness of your relationship with the Chinese Communist Party and tell not only your own people, but our own people how great we are. Like, this is the modern day tribute system, and it's primarily, again, not economic. It is about proving to the people of China that the PRC is in fact indeed the Zhongguo, that it does in fact indeed rule over Tianxia. And that is how they demonstrate legitimacy. Like, a lot of people have said for a long time that the deal in China was, we'll just provide enough jobs and give you a stable living and just don't rebel and we'll be fine. That's an economic social contract, but it's not a political social contract. Like, there is no internal legitimacy to the CCP. Like, we have internal legitimacy because of elections and the Constitution and like our understanding of where rights come from. The PRC has none of that. It is completely based on whether they can aspire to convince their own people that we are who we say we are, the Middle Kingdom. Our influence is unmitigated, and we can prove it to you with these foreigners who are coming to tell everyone how great we are. And very imperial, again, very imperial. And I think it's not about allies and partners. It's about other nations saying how awesome the party is and then them leveraging that for strategic ends.
Talk to us about the story of James Sun, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but internet tycoon from Singapore.
So most meetings that you take as a staffer are forgettable. Some of them you leave and you're like, well, that was kind of weird. And then others just kind of stick in your mind. And this meeting you're asking me, I was in the third category. At the time, my old boss, Ted Cruz, was advancing legislation that would rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy after the now deceased Nobel laureate, Dr. Liu Xiaobo, and longtime Democratic voice in China, imprisoned multiple times. He was president at Tiananmen Square in 1989. And I think he was imprisoned in like 1998 or so, and he was jailed for a long time. He won the Nobel Peace Prize while he was in prison. He was not allowed to go receive it, nor was his wife allowed to go receive it. And Ted Cruz basically said, let's make the party pay for being the only regime since Nazi Germany to prevent any representative to go receive a Nobel Peace Prize. And even more than that, let's expose how deeply corrupt and deathly afraid the party is of their own people. So the bill was, we're going to rename the street in front of the Chinese embassy Liu Xiaobo Way, or Drive, or whatever it was. And it became a top 3 lobbying priority for the embassy in Washington and the UN mission in New York. Because again, it's more than just like bad press, like whatever, like who cares? Like, they're not going to care if the New York Times hates them, like whatever. It was an issue for them because it's embarrassing to have every single piece of mail come into the Chinese embassy bear the name of the dissident you are trying to silence and slowly kill. Like, it exposes the nature of the party. And eventually, they try to find creative ways to kill the bill. And this individual you mentioned, James Sun, who's like some internet tycoon from Singapore, reached out to the office and asked for a meeting about the bill. So we took it. Myself and another staffer, we sit down, and these 2 like unnamed individuals like flank him on either side, and it's clear like they kind of have the build of like security or something, which is very odd. And it became very clear within like the first 3 to 5 minutes that this was like an unofficial emissary, I think, from the Ministry of State Security, because the shtick that he gave us was the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is sick of this. They're sick of just how much of an issue this has become. They're willing to let Liu Xiaobo's wife leave because at this time he had died from cancer. Like, they didn't allow him to get the cancer care he needed. He died, but his wife was still there. So they were like, they're ready to let her leave. But you have to understand that the Ministry of State Security doesn't take too kindly when upstarts in China challenge the legitimacy of the party, and it's an issue for them. So like, if you could just back off a little bit and give us some space, we might be able to figure this out. And we heard them out. And then I looked at them and said, that sounds like a problem for Xi Jinping, and it doesn't really sound like a problem for Senator Cruz. And then they left, and then a year or so later, they finally let her go. And it was an example, not just of like why standing for human rights is this good principled thing to do. It is a strategic thing to do in a Cold War because, again, where is your adversary weak and where are you strong? Morality and human rights is one of the biggest advantages the West and the United States has against the Chinese Communist Party. We are not afraid of our own people. Like the US government doesn't live like shivering in terror about what someone's going to tweet the next day. Like we are a stable system that values free speech. We celebrate it as part of who we are. We have free and fair elections, and that is legitimacy for us. They don't have any of that. The party's afraid of even moving a centimeter in that direction. So by exposing it, you not only are a voice to people who can't speak up for themselves, you challenge the party's own legitimacy inside of their own borders, which is really subversive. And that kind of terrain is where we need to take the competition.
Excellent. And you have a lot of great stories in your book, and I would encourage anyone to to purchase the book and read it because it really adds substance and texture to the many excellent I think points and observations that Michael makes throughout the book. I want to remind our audience members, both online and in here in person, that we do want to hear from you. So in about 5 minutes, I'm going to transition over to Q&A. For those of you joining us online, again, you can send us your questions via email at contact@globaltaiwan.org or to use the chat function on the YouTube page. You can tweet us also as well at Global Taiwan. So as we're sort of approaching the closing sort of portion of our conversation, and I have plenty more questions that I do want to ask you, but I do want to get back to sort of broader strategic landscape and how that applies to Taiwan. And so essentially this book, he wrote this book for Americans, to wake up Americans about the need for strategy to counter China, China's great game. But there's also a message in it, as I've read it, for other people as well, other nations as well. What is the message for the people of Taiwan?
I think first it's one of deep admiration from me personally, and I hope that my hope would be that anyone in Taiwan who read it would understand how seriously people in Washington are taking the situation that they're in. But I obviously want to speak for myself. Like number one, deep admiration for the courage that it takes to live every day in the shadow of the threat that Beijing casts daily. I would also say that I feel conflicted in saying don't give up hope in the United States. I kind of hedge to say that confidently because if you listen to Taiwan's leaders now, like they're very open that what happens in Ukraine matters to the security of Taiwan. And I am personally really concerned by the growing chorus of voices in DC who challenge that saying like Ukraine's not a core interest for us, and we need to redirect our resources to the theater that matters the most, which is Asia and Taiwan. But the same people who are saying that are also openly highly critical of Taiwan's approach to their own security. And like friends can have very honest conversations in private. I don't know that it's very helpful to castigate a friend publicly. And some of the voices that are calling to end assistance to Ukraine are also just super highly critical of Taiwan also. And my hope is that anyone from Taiwan who reads this book would come away with the sense that their safety is our safety and our security is their security. And I realize that legally that is not technically true because the Taiwan Relations Act doesn't go that far. But what I hope that they receive from this book is what Matt talks about in the foreword, which is the importance of candor. Like American presidents need to understand that speaking with clarity and honesty towards tyranny is not destabilizing. It is in fact very stabilizing because it shows them, number one, we know who you are behind the veneer, behind the mask that tyrants and dictatorship will often project outside to the world. And number two, we are not afraid to expose you. The projection of normalcy that despots and dictators will put on is one of their biggest assets, but it only works if people believe it. So I think the act of telling the truth in and of itself is meaningful, but with Taiwan, like the United States has to go beyond words. It has to be words and deeds. And this is the final thing I'll say about Taiwan. I think the most important thing for the United States is to stop looking at ourselves as a traffic cop in the Taiwan Strait. Like this notion that it's all process and not really about outcome for America with Taiwan's fate. Like somehow this creeped into our strategic consciousness over the years. And it's something I did recently was investigate the reflections of the people who actually wrote the TRA and voted on the TRA. And if you read how they talk about the TRA, it is not about reassuring Beijing. It is about reassuring Taipei, and even more than that, preserving the political, economic, and military relationship as if nothing had changed when diplomatic recognition switched in 1979. Like, I think one of the most important things for American policymakers to do is go back to our roots of rightly understanding the purpose of the Taiwan Relations Act and what our core interests actually are. Like Eli Ratner was 100% correct when he said that America has our own interests in the fate of Taiwan. He was beat up by a lot of people for saying that, and I think he was so obviously correct by saying that openly. And we should not be bashful or embarrassed or ashamed to say that we do have our own interests in the stake of Taiwan. Not only is it a democracy, like their fate matters substantively to us, our own security. So I think there's nothing that should hold us back from saying that.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Michael.
And then now I'd like to open it up for questions and answers from our audience members. So if you just please raise your hand, as well as please try to limit your questions to one question or two. That's fine.
Wait for the microphone, please. Let's go.
Thanks so much. My name is Ken Scabe from a corporation, a Japanese private company. So as you may know, because I think almost all of Japanese know about the Chinese tribute system because we are taught in the elementary school. So I think I quite agree with your argument. And so I have two questions. So how their strategy will proposal different from other recent strategy? For example, like a strategy of denial, with COVID.
Yeah.
Argument. And my second question is, do you think the former President Trump see that kind of strategy as a very important thing? And if he regained the White House, what do you think his Chinese or Taiwanese policy look like?
Oh, man. Gosh. So let's start with the 45th president. I think one of the most important scoops that any journalist in Washington got about President Trump's China policy was in Josh Rogan's book, Chaos Under Heaven. And it was in the first chapters. He talks about a unnamed Republican senator who was in the Oval Office with Trump, and the topic of Taiwan came up. And as I recall, the senator was trying to convince the former president why Taiwan mattered so much. And what Trump reportedly said was, Taiwan is 8,000 miles away and it's like 2 feet away from China. If China ever invades, there's not a expletive thing we're ever going to do about it. Not officially confirmed that Trump ever said it, but I know Josh, and many of us follow Josh's reporting. tend to trust Josh when he reports things. So Trump is so mercurial. Like, yeah, he took the phone call from Tsai Ing-wen, and then he realized that Xi Jinping was mad about it and cut off all communications. And when he found out that a State Department official was visiting Taiwan at like a sensitive moment for like trade negotiation, I think, he got really upset and recalled the State Department official immediately. And for him, my own estimate of him is he lacks, if his focus is not on the history of our alliance partnerships or the history of our credibility or like geopolitics. His instinct, like his instincts during his time in the private sector, is trying to make a deal. And I don't know what that means for Taiwan, but I don't get the sense that he views the CCP or even like Xi Jinping as like American adversaries. Like, sure, he's upset about like he talked about unfair trade practices in his 2016 campaign. He was really upset at China for COVID, which I think obviously everyone should be. But I don't know that he really views Taiwan in the sense of like this Cold War issue of importance or this issue of democratic importance that must be secured. I don't get that sense from him. But what does that mean if he were to win? What does that mean for his China policy? Like, I would be lying if I told you I know, because I don't. But I've seen enough, not because of his advisors. Like, I think a lot of his advisors were excellent on Taiwan in his first administration, like excellent in so many ways. And even his cabinet officials doing incredibly wonderful things. But him personally, I don't know. I've seen some stuff that concerns me, but we'll see.
I have time for one last question, Jim.
Richard Coleman, frequent visitor to Taiwan. We survived the April earthquake.
Oh,
Wow.
125 miles away from Hualien. You're talking about China not having the burden of worrying about allies, but from a strictly utilitarian standpoint, if it were your call, you're doing the plank, the Republicans have a plank this year. What would you be saying about the need to fund Ukraine and fund Taiwan defenses and our relationship with NATO?
Oh, man. I think the challenging and almost awkward part of this debate is that whether you are saying Ukraine is a distraction from the most important issue, which a lot of people would say is the Indo-Pacific, or if you're saying that we don't have the luxury of picking regions because our adversaries are interconnected and working with each other, like China and Russia, like China's benefiting from the war in Ukraine. But whatever side you're on, both sides make legitimate points. Like people like Bridge Bolby, like when they talk about like Asia first or the need to prioritize Taiwan over Ukraine, their argument's primarily one of capability, which is America is not the superpower we used to be, and we lack the capacity to be actively leading and deter incredibly multiple regions simultaneously. It's a capability argument. The folks on the other side make a credibility-based argument, which is we don't have the luxury of choosing because Tsai Ing-wen and Joseph Wu and so many others like keep on saying over and over again that the security of Ukraine matters to the security of Taiwan, and that Xi Jinping is watching very closely how we behave in relation to Vladimir Putin, just as Putin was watching our pullout from Afghanistan. It was hopelessly bungled. So I think both sides focus on equally true realities, capabilities, and credibility. The answer is not one's right and one's wrong, like they're both right. And this really difficult position that the United States is in is, well, so if that's the case, what do we do? And I tend to fall in the camp of the global order that we live in now was built on the overwhelming preponderance of American power, which we are still the most powerful country in the world, but we no longer have preponderance of power like we did. There is no other alternative. And this is the really awkward part of where we are in like history right now. Absent American leadership, Europe is not primed to defend itself in a way that I don't know if they could on their own stop Putin. Maybe, maybe not, but that's not really how NATO is designed to operate militarily right now. If you look at our troop deployment in Europe, that in and of itself is the answer. But American presence and leadership in NATO is how it was always been meant to work. And it's also equally true that Taiwan needs American leadership to survive. And we don't have the luxury of choosing, but that also doesn't eradicate the capability issue. So this is where I think my book comes in. We need to start competing at the asymmetric point against our adversaries. Yes, we need to look at China's force buildup and say we've got to find a way to credibly match that, but that's like symmetrical comparisons. We need to find where are they weak and where are we strong. I think it's really easy to think that the CCP is a 10-foot tall giant, and they are absolutely not. And chapter 5 and chapter 6 of Countering China's Great Game rests on that pressure point and ask, where are there practical vulnerabilities that we can exploit, not only to weaken their strategy, but to turn them inward so they can have less bandwidth to focus on their external belligerence and aggression. Because if we can get them focused internally, and this is what like Matt and Gallagher were arguing, that's where we want them to be focusing. It's not just enough to play the symmetrical game of how many ships they have, how many ships do we have. We have got to start forcing them to compete on terrain where they are uncomfortable in. If we can do that, we have a shot.
I think that's an excellent note to leave today's discussion on. Again, I just don't want to leave our audience members from the session thinking that, Michael has written a great book and sort of in mind a problem. He actually comes out with, practical solutions and, creative ones at that in terms of what's being discussed here in Washington. And I really encourage you all to purchase a copy of the book, read it. More importantly, read it and purchase it. And then really thank you, Michael, for, making the effort, the physical, the mental, mentally demanding, efforts to write this book, because I think, we're all the more richer intellectually for it. So thank you very much, Michael, for joining us. And for those of you here in the audience today, Michael has the books. Michael's book will be actually available for purchase at a discount. So please, if you don't already have a copy, purchase it here today. And he has also generously agreed to sign your copy if you do so. With that. We'll bring today's session to a close. Thank you so much, Michael, and welcome you back anytime here at GTI.
Thank you so much for having me, Russell. I really appreciate it.